Is your combine costing you yield at harvest time? Answer, probably yes. We're going to dig into how you fix it in this episode of Extreme Ag's Cutting the Curve.
Welcome to Extreme Ag's Cutting the Curve podcast, where real farmers share real insights and real results to help you improve your farming operation. This episode is brought to you by Simon Innovation. Protect your crops and maximize yields with a full lineup of innovative precision tools engineered to enhance the efficiency and accuracy of your sprayer. Visit simoninnovations.com and start getting more ROI out of your sprayer. And now, here's your host, Damian Mason.
Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of Extreme Ag's Cutting the Curve. I'm joined by one of the founders of Extreme Ag, Kevin Matthews, who's coming to us from his sprayer, spraying late season Morning Glory and Burr Cucumber in a cornfield he's going to be harvesting in a month. But he's making time for you. I've got also Brian Robertson, the founder of Estes Performance Concaves. They make concaves that you put on aftermarket on your combine. And we talked about this a little bit at one of our field days. We talked about how to make the most out of your combine. We had a combine clinic as one of our webinars. But this is an important subject. Kevin said before I hit the record button, you're losing about 75% of your yield. You're losing about 75% of the loss that you have, I should say. You're not losing 75% of your yield. I misspoke. About 75% of the loss that you have happens in a certain moment of the combine, meaning back in the guts of your combine. And a lot of guys don't see it, or they don't know how to address it, and that's what we want to dig into here. So a combine gets its name because it combined cutting, threshing, and separation, or sometimes called winnowing. The cutting bar, then the stuff in the middle, then the stuff that goes out the back. There's a lot of moving parts. How can you prevent loss? So, Brian, I'm going to start with Kevin, because we know that you're going to talk about what goes on in the guts. Kevin, you've been running a combine since you were a kid. They're better than they used to be, but if you don't have them set up right, you're still losing some of the precious yield that you worked so hard to grow.
Yeah, no question. They're amazing pieces of equipment now, extremely technology advanced compared with the 4400 I started with years ago in a 213 glove bar and then a 4.0 corn head. But the thing you've got to do is you've got to start out with a good even crop going into that combine, and that makes the head very important. But when we're picking corn, for instance, you can have a tremendous amounts of header loss from not having proper deck plate spacing. You may have gather chains wore out. You may have the deck plates wore out. You may be running the header way too fast. You could be running it too slow, getting butt shatter. There's all different things that can be going on there. And so you got to know how to really find those losses and fine tune that combine. But the header is a very critical component to identify where your problems are beginning at. And then as we get into the machine, the biggest thing I see now is, we run mostly John Deere's, and we're also running the Clouds this year as well. But with our John Deere's, you have many different concaves to put inside that machine, and you got separator options for your grapes in the separator section. And most people, I hate to say it, but they overlook it, and they get out and walk and check, and they say, okay, I'm seeing a few kernels on the ground, we're good. Well, that's what some companies call an acceptable loss. Well, my remark is to that company employee is, how much of your paycheck is acceptable to remove from your paycheck each week? And they're going to tell you 0.
Right.
But if I'm going to buy a combine and spend that much money, that's what I expect coming out the back is 0 grain.
Mm-hmm.
Can that happen 100% of the time? Probably not, but I'm going to say when it's set up properly and the right concaves in it and a good operator, you can get that in the 99+% range. You can do a good job. And that is really overlooked. When you start getting 4, 5, 6% loss, it adds up. And we could spend an hour talking about all this.
I just run the numbers. I want to make sure I was thinking about this right. 4% loss on a 250 bushel corn field yield is 10 bushels. So that means you got that's 560 pounds of corn. I think that's a neat way of looking at it. That's 560 pounds of corn laying out there on every acre. That's a hell of a lot. I mean, you say, all right, that's also at $4. That's $40. Your margin in an environment like this, your margin could be $40 an acre. Because we're obviously in skinny times. Brian Robertson, starting up the front. Okay, how do we lose yield? The reel, it's going too fast. Shatter. Your bar misses some of the soybeans because it's cutting too high. I mean, there's all kinds of ways I've seen it happen, but you're the expert. I'm not.
Yeah. So like Kevin said, it starts with the head. And if you don't have that head set right, you're going to have what we call header loss. So what he mentioned is too fast, too slow. If your deck plates are worn out, like in corn or whatever it may be. And
by the way, I don't know what a deck plate does. Kevin, what's a deck plate do and how does it get worn out?
So the deck plate is what actually snap it. Well, you got snapping rollers. The rollers pull the stalk down, and then the deck plates are sitting there, and it basically is an orifice. It's only going to allow so much material through, and you want it so that ear of corn hits in between them deck plates, but yet you don't want it wide enough that you create what we call butt shelling, causing the kernels to splatter. So the deck plates is part of the separation of the ear from the stalk.
And Damon, the point of setting the deck plates right is because you don't want to pull the whole plant into the combine. You want the ears coming in and as little other material as possible, because the more of the plant that you pull in, the more the combine is congested with stuff other than the ears and trying to thresh it. So the more stuff that comes in the machine, the harder it is for the machine to thresh the material and separate it, more importantly.
Okay.
Which means separation means getting it in the machine.
Okay, so we talked about, you said header loss is your cutter's moving too fast, your reel's moving too fast. I mean, I'm thinking what's moving too fast that causes header, and then also if your height is wrong, that's where you lose it at the header. So those are the two ways?
Any of it is common. And a lot of times it's operator error. They're just not taking the time to set it accordingly to the conditions that you're in.
Got it.
Yeah, and something else that I see is they don't take the time to set. You need to set your header speed relative to how fast you're running the combine. So some guys will try to run it at 5-6 miles an hour in third gear, and the head's too slow, and you're pushing the corn over. A lot of guys don't set the speed of the header relative to their ground speed, and that's a pretty common problem that people do.
So, by the way, how do I know this? I'm not doing this all just based on what feels good. Surely to God, these manufacturers, they're selling you an $800,000 combine. They probably have instructions that says if you're going 3.5 miles per hour, your header should be set up like this. If you're going 4, if your yield is 250 bushel corn versus 150. There's all kinds of parameters here. If I'm going through 150 bushel corn, it's going to be a hell of a lot different setup or speed for sure than it is a 250 bushel corn. I'm not just doing this based on how I feel that day, am I?
Well, your operator's manual is a starting point. But at the end of the day, Damian, the industry does a poor job of teaching. And the reason that is those that in the industry has not had the opportunities to get out and run the combines like the farmer does.
Yeah.
And a real good technician will tell you that if I could have some of the hours that operator has in that machine, I could be a much better technician. And that's one thing that I got to give Brian credit for, or Estes credit for, was they actually bought their own machine and put it in the field and ran countless hours on it and learned those sweet spots and how to set it and what makes it different so they could teach their customers so they would have a good experience. And others do that as well, but it just stands out as I've watched the depthness that they put into the research behind the products.
Brian, okay, we talked about the header loss. So really, what I just heard from Kevin is it's not like you just told everybody do this, because it's going to vary based on the crop you're harvesting, the quantity per acre, and then also the speed that you're able to go. Matt Miles, if it's one of those wet falls or wet summers, he's going to be going slower, presumably because of ground conditions, or maybe Kelly Garrett's going to have to be going slower because of the hills he's in versus somebody that's in flat and dry. I mean, there's a lot of variables.
Exactly. And it like Kevin said, it's just time in the seat. And a lot of operators, good operators, go by feel. They don't really go by the book per se, because there's so many different variables, like you said. So that's, there's header loss. And then when it gets pulled into the machine, then you get into what we call rotor loss, or separator loss that goes out the back of the machine. So that one.
And by the way, you even have some numbers on that. So I want to go ahead and just bait the listener. You have some numbers, some actual data. Kevin already used 4%, which is the number I latched on to. And that, like I said, if you're pushing high yields, that comes to a big amount of using corn. But 4% on soybeans, I can run the same numbers. You're throwing a lot of pounds back out there in your field, which I guess you can say is seeding cover crops, but it's also eroding away your margins in a pretty skinny year. So, all right, talk to me about then rotor loss.
Okay, so if you want to start with the figures, just on 1,000 acres of corn, 1,000 acres of soybeans, and 1,000 acres of wheat, just as a general. And if you do 10,000 acres, multiply it by 10. But you're losing on just rotor loss $25,000 a year.
Is that a dollar amount or is that a bushel amount?
That's a dollar amount.
Okay.
Yeah, 25,000. And these are not figures that I'm just back of the envelope. These are what we've tested and seen.
Okay, so if I farmed 3,000 acres and that was a mix between one third corn, 1/3 soy, 1/3 wheat, you just did that because you want to make sure you're giving an example that almost every farmer, row crop farmer or broadacre farmer can relate to. Kevin, before we get to Kevin, I want to ask, you came up with that because you trialed that and you said, and that's because I don't have things set up from the front to the back.
Correct. And that's grain loss that we've counted. That is combination of actually the way we did that trial. That's mainly rotor loss. One of the ways Kevin probably knows, but if you want to know if you're having header loss or rotor loss, one of the easiest things you can do is raise your chopper and drop it in windrow. And if you drop it in windrow, it's kind of like at the Farm Progress show. When you drop it in windrow, everything that's coming out of the rotor gets dropped right like in a windrow, and you can go out there and look through it, and you can easily tell what the loss was from the rotor. Anything on the outside of that windrow would be header loss. So it's pretty easy to tell if you raise that chopper what your rotor loss is and what your header loss is.
Okay, so that number you just gave me there, that was, by the way, that's going to vary with the price of the commodity.
Correct.
I mean, you gave me $25,000. Is that in today's commodity prices?
That's today's prices.
Okay, so that's $8 an acre, right? $25,000 over. It's about $8, a little over $8 an acre, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in the scope of things, a guy like Kevin's going to tell me, I've got a hell of a lot of dollars invested in every acre. Maybe that $8 is something I just have to have acceptable loss because it's not as bad as we thought, where it's 4 or 5%. $8 an acre. He's got $8 an acre blowing in the wind a lot of different ways. So I guess you should address that.
The big thing, Damian, is there is no acceptable loss. I preach it, and I'm just not happy. That's something I can control. That's something I can do better, and that's what I'm going to do as a farmer. But there's so many things that affect it that are overlooked, and proper installment of your concaves, whether they're OEMs or whether they're Estes or whoever you choose to use. Brian talked about running too much fodder through the machine by not having your header set right. Even when you have the best amount of going through, it still is a ton of work to separate that crop. And having those separator grates that Brian has designed with those disruptors in there has been a game changer for us. And, the beauty of the way that crop feeds into that concave with this new design, you're running so much slower. And the RPMs of the rotor, typically you can do 270 on your rotor in 24% corn and do a phenomenal job, whereas before I would be running 380 to 400. And that's a lot of diesel fuel, a lot of horsepower, and then the integrity of the grain that you get from that slower speed. Same for soybeans. We grew seed beans for several years, and with running the feed accelerator in low speed, that is another plus that you do with this concave. Is the only time you would run it in high speed is possibly in wheat, and I don't even know that that's necessary all the time. Brian can talk more about that. But the slower the speeds that's needed to thresh this crop, the less fuel you're going to burn. And I like it, and the better grain quality and the storability of that grain is tremendous.
And something that goes off that, Kevin, the faster you're running your rotor, the faster you're moving the material through the machine, and the less time you're giving it to separate, which also contributes to the rotor loss.
Okay. All right. So rotor loss is where you think most of it seems to me there's an awful big chance of losing up front, right? I mean, if you talked about your reels moving too fast, your grain head's tilted wrong. I mean, there's a lot of stuff you're driving 4 miles an hour through a field. Up front, I can knock down stuff. I mean, I can do a lot of damage before it ever gets into the rotor, right, Brian?
You can do some damage, but you have to remember the crop is whole at that point. So, like, the ears are whole. So as long as you're getting that ear in the machine, which 99% of the time you are, 99.9% of the time you are getting the ear in, then it's all up to the machine and the concaves and the separator to get that threshed and out into the machine. So, we talked about $25,000 that is attributable to rotor loss. That's with your traditional round bar concaves, and that's what most people run. With our system, we get it down to about a tenth of that. So just the effectiveness of that, $25,000, you don't want to lose that. But if you can pay a small amount and get that down 90%, why wouldn't you do it? And that's only talking about one factor. That's only talking about rotor loss. And what Kevin had mentioned that people don't think about is loss contributable to fines and splits. Yep. That ends up in the grain tank, which you can see. You can turn around and see, or when you're on the combine, you can pull a sample in your hand, you can see the fines and splits. But beyond that is the hidden loss that people really don't think about, and that's what ends up in the grain bin after drying or the next season. And we've had customers haul out 50 truckloads of fines less from going from OEM to our system. And 50 truckloads, well, put it this way, 20 truckloads is $100,000. Mm-hmm. So
So the answer is on the stuff inside the rotor, which is a lot of complexity. There's a lot of moving parts. I was with you at the Farm Prior show. We opened up the combine. It's overwhelming. All the belts and all the moving parts, all that. Your first answer to the person listening to this says, okay, what am I supposed to do? You're going to say, well, put in Estes Performance Concaves XPR3s, which is our new version. And they're going to say, well, is that all there is to it? Because, it sounds like maybe it's too easy of a fix. There's more to it than that. Kevin, what else do I need to do to prevent rotor loss?
Well, you got to have that concave installed properly. It's got to be level from front to back. That's extremely critical. You need to have the separator grate set correctly. When you put them in, you want to make sure you have the proper clearance. You also need to make sure that your tines on your rotor and your rasp bars on your rotor are in good shape, because you can have a perfect concave and a perfect separator grate, but if those tines are worn, then it's not doing properly. another thing is you got to remember how a rotor works. A rotor is not like a cylinder machine. A rotor works thrashing grain on grain. And where Brian and the guys, his team has got this slower rotor speed, it allows more time for that rotor to stay full to where it's thrashing grain on grain. And that is how he's reducing all the fines and reducing the crack damage, because it's a cushion, it's a softer surface for the grain to go through. But the biggest thing I like outside of that is something we hadn't talked about, is the broad settings that you got with this. The versatility is so much easier for the operator to find that sweet spot with this system versus our standard OEM, where you're constantly having to adjust and try to get this right and that right to prevent these losses. And that is the one thing that's so good, is when you get an inexperienced operator in there, you can set that machine and you can get it pretty darn good. It may not be perfect across every little situation the operator runs in, but it's a lot easier to train a guy or a lady to run that machine with this set of concaves and separator grates in and do a decent quality job and yet not run none out on the ground. If we can get it in the tank, we can do something about it. But if we run it out the back, it's over.
Right. Okay, so the one thing I just heard right there is a couple things. First off, if I use an Estes concave, I can turn my rotor slower, and therefore the grain is being threshed up against other grain versus knocking into metal, which reduces grain damage. Brian, is that what I heard?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And I can set rotor speed. I don't know. I haven't run a combine. I've sat in them, but hell, I haven't run a combine. I don't run combines. Can I sit up there in a cab and reduce rotor speed?
So with the rotor speed, you can, like Kevin said, run his rotor at 270, 280 versus 380 or 400 early on. You know, that's a difference of 30% reduction in rotor speed. And by doing that, you're going to have more grain on grain action. You're going to be able to keep that rotor more full. And by doing that, you're going to have less grain damage. Also, by running it slower, you're keeping it in the rotor longer, giving you more time to separate it.
Okay. What about then beyond concaves? Where am I losing and how do I prevent it?
So the non-obvious place that you're losing it is, we mentioned that you see the fines and the splits when you're harvesting. But when you take that and put it into the bin, whether you're drying it down or you're harvesting it 15, 16% and you're just putting it in the bin, when that is dried down and you go to move that grain, the amount of fines that are left after you empty that bin is lost. And that is not something that you see initially, because if you're harvesting at 20, 23%, the hairline cracks are there, but you may not see them. Once you dry it down to 15, 14%, as that kernel contracts and dries out, those hairline splits become big splits, and that turns into fines.
All right, Brian, obviously, as a concave company, is it as easy as changing a concave and I prevent a whole bunch of that rotor loss? I mean, that sounds too good to be true. There's a little bit more than that.
No question about it. And, you know, you got to have the proper install. You got to have the proper operator. And, you know, the one thing that we've not talked about is, we touched on it a little bit, but I want to emphasize this. If you ever took those heavy small wire concaves out for small grain, you'll remember this. But this system, you do not have to remove. Once you put your concaves in, all you need to do is your general maintenance and check your levelness of it and make sure that they're inspected and you've not done no damage during this harvest season. You do not remove them from crop to crop unless you just want to do an inspection. That is a lot of money and time saved right there. The grain quality is second to none. is what I've seen with it. It's amazing. The user friendliness in the operations is much simpler. You don't have to just constantly fine tune. And I will tell you, a lot of people get frustrated. They get it set, they just run, and they want to get your crop in, but there's a lot of money put on the ground. And so really the attention to detail and the perfection that you can put into the harvest with this setup has been second to none with everything I've ran. And I have run a lot of machines and a lot of different stuff, but right. The quality is superb.
Got it. All right, Brian, by the way, there's 3 times he said make sure that they're level. How the hell does a piece of does a concave inside of a combine get so out of level? I'm trying to figure that out. What happens?
Well, a lot of times whenever they set it up, they'll check the level, but they won't do necessary steps to make sure it's level. So you need to cycle the concaves. As you're leveling, you need to cycle the concave, meaning run the concave all the way closed to all the way open, and check it. And then, halfway through season or midway or sometime during season, recheck it, because you have to remember the combine is going through a lot of times really rough fields, and it's the same as anything. It's kind of like toe straps you're putting on your trailer. They were tight when you left, but as you're running down the road, all that vibration and stuff can kind of adjust themselves or work themselves in, and you need to check it periodically. And it's a quick check. It doesn't, you can check it with an Allen wrench pretty quick. So it's just something that helps, because if your concave isn't level, the reason it's important is you may not be running the same clearance all the way across the concave, meaning if the front of the concave is, say, 10 millimeters and your back of your concave is 13 millimeters, but your crop is getting threshed and the crop is getting reduced, well, the rear of the concave is further away from the rotor, meaning less friction, less threshing, and you're going to lose it. So it is very important, and I'm glad that Kevin has mentioned it and emphasized it, because it's very important. It's very important with all systems, but particularly with ours, just because if you want that maximum performance, you need to have it level.
All right, Kevin, you've got you've got the point that it's not just stuff that you lose it up the front, maybe you knock it over, it doesn't get in the head, you lose yield going out the back because it's happening mostly in the rotor. That's where Brian says most of the loss happens. But there's another thing that happens, even if the grain gets into your hopper but it's damaged, that ends up costing you yield because you get docked, doesn't store well, it ends up becoming dust or whatever. So just address that as our last point about how we can prevent yield loss at the combine.
Yes, that is very critical. The biggest thing is you got to get out of the combine and you got to check. And you can't assume that your loss monitors are 100% right, because they have to be calibrated based on field conditions. So you got to get out and check. And one reason we want to talk about the difference in the header loss and the separator loss is the header loss is easy. You get out of the combine right there, and the fodder has not been spread out over it, so you can see if there's kernels on the ground or soybeans on the ground. But in the back, nobody wants to get down on their hands and knees and dig down. And what I have our auger cart guy do is he's always constantly riding right beside the standing corn and looking and in the soybeans, and if he sees soybeans or corn thrown over in that unharvested area, I can promise you it come out of the back of that combine.
Yeah, right.
So that's an easy way to have a second set of eyes, is let that auger cart driver understand his job. Not only is his job to keep that machine running efficiently and the trucks rolling, but is also to be a second set of eyes and ears out there in the field as to what kind of job that operator's doing in that combine. And the help is very appreciated by the operator.
Got it. All right, Brian, is your combine cost you yield? Answer, most likely. You've done a bunch of experiments. You've done it everywhere. What's the worst you've seen and what's the best you've seen? In other words, did you help somebody out and you're like, do you realize you're losing 8% of your yield? Did you ever have that bad experience?
We've seen worse. I've seen up in Indiana, actually, a guy.
Hey, wait a minute. Let's start talking about these Indiana people.
Yeah. So this was a couple years ago, and a guy had some problem corn. It had some disease, and the cob was real rubbery, and it was hard to thresh. And with the round bars he had been running, he was losing like 10 bushels an acre, 20 bushels an acre. And a neighbor of his brought his machine over with our combine, brought his machine over with our system in it and was running. And he was losing like half a bushel. And that farmer that day said that he had put enough corn on the ground in that one field to buy 2 of our systems.
Right. So your combine's costing you yield. You say answer most likely. You've learned a lot on this whole front. So besides the concaves, there's a whole bunch of stuff from the front to the back of the combine, I guess, is the big takeaway.
Absolutely. Get your butt out of that cab and check it out every once in a while on the ground. Do a power shutdown. Shut it down with a separator full. Get out, check everything, see where the grain's at, see if you're getting it off the ear. And if you're unsure where to set your concave at, get you a set of calipers and keep in there. Or if you don't want to spend that kind of money, you can get them about $6 to $8, $20, however fancy you want them. Grab a wrench out of your toolbox. You got an 18 millimeter wrench, stick it around that corn cob. If it's 18 millimeter corn cob, you know where to set your clearance at on your rotor, on your concave. So there's a lot of cheat sheets out there, and just keep it simple.
And Kevin, one important thing that we didn't mention was zeroing your concave. So if you see it at 18, but your zero is, say you zeroed it when the concave was 6 millimeters away, well, then you're actually at 24 millimeters.
Very good point. I forgot that. Very good point. Absolutely critical. Don't assume that meter says it's correct. If the meter says 0 in the combine, don't assume that's correct if you hadn't leveled.
Yeah, you need to check it.
Leveling, and if you go through they've done a really good job preparing an instruction sheet. And if you do the steps correctly, you'll measure that and you'll zero that calibration out during the process. And he is 100% right, Damian. That gets overlooked.
Got it. His name's Kevin Matthews. He's founder of Extreme Ag. He's coming to you from the field. He's joined by Brian Robertson, founder of Estes Performance Concaves. Their new XPR3 concaves are out, and Kevin will be running them this fall as his harvest is just commencing. And I'm guessing he'll probably shoot a video and tell you how they're working for him. So till next time, thanks for being here. That's Brian. That's Kevin. I'm Damian. This is Extreme Ag Cutting the Curve.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cutting the Curve. Make sure to check out extremeag.farm for more great content to help you squeeze more profit out of your farming operation. Cutting the Curve is brought to you by Simon Innovations. Don't let your sprayer's limitations hold you back. Visit simoninnovations.com and upgrade your sprayer's capabilities now.